I'm signalling today that we are making preparations to allow green zone flights from Melbourne to New Zealand from Wednesday onwards. There will be some restrictions on those flights initially. They will be limited to New Zealand citizens and residents, those who are normally resident in New Zealand, and some critical workers. Those returning on those flights will have to have a pre-departure test, a negative pre-departure test, within the 72 hours before they get on that flight. That recognises that they have effectively been in isolation for 14 days by next Wednesday, which is the time they would spend in managed isolation if they had come to New Zealand under the arrangements that we had before the Trans-Tasman bubble was operating. So I acknowledge it's a further inconvenience. They have to stay a little bit longer. But we are making preparations to allow them to start coming home from next Wednesday, and we're working with the airlines on that. We're also working with the government in Victoria. At the moment, the current lockdown restrictions in Melbourne prevent that from happening. People are not allowed to leave their place where they are currently isolating in order to travel, and we're working with them to make sure that by the time this comes into effect, even if their restrictions are still in place, people will be able to travel, first of all, to get their pre-departure test, and then also to travel to the airport in order to come home to New Zealand. Our health assessment is that people who meet those requirements, so they've been isolating for that 14-day period, they've had a negative pre-departure test, that's a very low risk to New Zealand, and therefore they will be able to come back through the green zone and return back home to New Zealand. There are a couple of other provisions that I want to remind people of. One is that for those who were in Victoria before our pause commenced, in that period between the 20th and the 25th, they are able to return, but are no longer in Victoria, they are able to return home to New Zealand now, providing they have a negative pre-departure test within 72 hours. I can also confirm that that includes people who are in Victoria now, but have not been in the Greater Melbourne area during the period of their lockdown. They can travel, if they can travel, to another state in order to travel to New Zealand, and then they would be able to come back that way. They would also need to have a negative pre-departure test 72 hours before they were able to board a flight to New Zealand. People who have been in any of the locations of interest, either in Victoria or in New South Wales, are still prevented from travelling to New Zealand, regardless of all of the things that I have just said. They are still prevented from travelling to New Zealand within 14 days of their potential exposure, regardless of whether one of those other criteria may apply to them. I do acknowledge, once again, that this is a significant disruption. It is something that we foreshadowed was possible when the Trans-Tasman bubble opened. We are making sure, in planning for potential New Zealanders' return from the middle of next week, that we are not doing that in any way that increases the risk of COVID-19 getting into New Zealand and potentially spreading in the New Zealand community. So hence we are being cautious, which is what we have always foreshadowed we would be. But we also recognise that if people have been doing 14 days of isolation in Melbourne and they have a negative pre-departure test, that at that point the risk is low. It is possible that it will take some time for people to be able to come back. We're working with the airlines to understand what the capacity will be of those flights returning to New Zealand. The fact that they are able to bring the flights back through the green zone they've indicated to us that that will mean that they can bring in more flights more quickly. But if there is a need in some way to prioritise, we'll sort that out in the next 24 to 48 hours, and we'll let people know how that process will work. If it does transpire that sufficient capacity is there that people will just be able to book their flights and come back, then obviously that will be available. But if there's a need to ration initially, then we'll set out a process for that. But that'll be worked on over the next 24 to 48 hours.